Welcome to the Taxpayers Defense Conference. We focus on problems resolution issues, IRS dispute resolution, taxpayers' rights, IRS abuse prevention and cure. That's the focus of this conference for the next 2 days. So let's start out. We've got this very cleverly arranged in two different segments here. We're going to do all the day one material first and the day two material on the second day. You've got all that organized in your folders in that order. So take out your outlines for session one. We're going to stripe the field as to what we're dealing with the IRS right now. We all know that the IRS is in a state of turmoil. I want to lay that out for us here. The title is IRS in Transition. There have been more changes in IRS leadership in the last 9 months than I've ever seen in my career. As long as I've been paying attention, which is north of 45 years, there has been more turmoil in the IRS's structure and leadership than at any time in the past. We have lost 7 commissioners so far this year. When Trump took office in January of 2025, the commissioner at that time was Danny Werfel, who was well suited to be commissioner. He was very qualified. He worked for both the IRS in a number of different roles, including acting commissioner a number of years past, and he worked in the private sector in very large businesses and handled the administration of large organizations with very large budgets. He had bipartisan support when he was nominated and confirmed as commissioner after Charles left the job. Trump made it clear, which is his prerogative, made it clear that he was going to bring his own people in. Werfel resigned as of January 20th or 21st when Trump was sworn into office. Since that time, we've had 5 acting commissioners, and 1 commissioner, Billy Long, was confirmed by the Senate and took office in June of 2025. Long was there a total of 2 weeks in the job, and then he left. We're still not exactly sure why he got bumped from that role. Some say he got fired, some say he resigned. Trump nominated him to be the ambassador of Iceland. Why the ambassador of Iceland, I don't know. He was the 7th commissioner. We are currently functioning without an IRS commissioner. What has happened to Billy Long is interesting, because Senator Ron Wyden, he might be my favorite senator in the United States Senate. He is just a radical leftist nut from Oregon. And Wyden, of course, has opposed every single thing that every Republican president has done since he's been in office. He opposed Billy Long all along, as did every Democrat senator on the Senate Finance Committee that was overseeing the nominations for this role. Wyden has made allegations of significant wrongdoing on the part of Billy Long, but didn't specify what they were. We don't really have any background. There's some rumors about this or that. Even a bribery rumor surfaced at some point along the way. What the substance of that is, how that could be, who knows what happened. But the fact of the matter is, there has been nothing definitive about Billy Long and the wrongdoing he's alleged to have committed. One thing is for sure, Long had no qualifications for the job. He was in Congress for 6 terms. He was elected from the state of Missouri. His professional background was a real estate agent and an auctioneer. He also hosted a radio show for a number of years. When he was in Congress, he did not serve on any of the tax writing committees. He wasn't on any of the IRS subcommittees. He wasn't on any of the IRS oversight committees. His experience had to do with some international stuff and a lot of agricultural stuff. Being from Missouri, it would have been natural for him to be in those agricultural roles, and that's where he is, or was, I should say. So he had no background in tax. He had no background, certainly, in running an organization the size of the IRS. When Long was nominated to take control of the IRS, they had roughly 100,000 employees. They're down a little bit now. We'll talk about that in just a minute. He had no experience in running an organization the size of the IRS with the budget of the IRS. At that time, their annual appropriation was about $12.5 billion. With the supplemental funding from the Inflation Reduction Act, their annual budget was north of $20 billion. He had no experience running that kind of organization. When he left Congress, or I should say, Wyden claimed that when Long left Congress, he went straight into the tax fraud industry, his only real experience in tax before the nomination. What did Wyden mean by he went into the tax fraud industry? Long was associated with a company that was marketing the employee retention credit. Is the employee retention credit on its face fraudulent? Anyone? Yes? Of course not. The credit was created by Congress. They're the idiots that wrote the law. Wyden couldn't have been more supportive of the employer retention credit when the thing was passed in March of 2020. He was behind behind it all the way. We got to help these businesses. This COVID thing is going to strangle businesses. We got to get this thing passed. So he was a cheerleader for it. And is there fraud associated with the employee retention credit? Of course. But when you have a federal government that's passing out upwards of $9 trillion in free money, don't you think that's going to raise some fraud issues? Don't you think that's going to create some situations where people are nefariously and dubiously taking this money under false pretenses? Say, yes, of course it's going to happen. You can't have these kinds of giveaways without encouraging fraud. It just happens. All right, now we can go down that road and talk about that, but we're not going to go there any farther. So where are we at right now? Treasury Secretary Scott now is serving as acting commissioner. I believe that this creates significant concerns. I've written about this at length here in the last couple of months. I think it creates significant concerns for the capacity to do the job. Bessent's first responsibility is to handle the new tariff deals and the negotiations with various countries compared to historically what's happened. Tariff deals are coming out. It seems like every week there's another tariff deal. The Treasury has to implement, oversee, and enforce these tariff deals, and that's Bessent's first responsibility. The trade deals, negotiations, tariff amendments, and dealing with all of that creates a significant demand on the Treasury Secretary. How is he going to split his duties between that and functioning as the acting commissioner of the IRS? We got the added problem now. We got really two added problems that Bessent has to deal with, and that is the reduced staff of the IRS. I said when Trump took office, employment level in the Internal Revenue Service was roughly 100,000 employees. As of October 1st, the day before the shutdown, the IRS had about 75,000 employees. They've lost 25,000 employees in that period of time. And so clearly that's got to be managed. That's got to be addressed, how they're going to overcome that. So where we're at here, we've got the Treasury Secretary with these functions, but now what is the IRS Commissioner's role at this point in time? Now, obviously you got you got the day-to-day responsibilities of the IRS Commissioner in that he's managing just call it $11 billion budget. He's got to manage that budget, but he's also got to manage the 75,000 employees in a tax code that consists of more than 4 million words that Congress just changed again as a result of the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, friends. The One Big Beautiful Act changes have to be implemented. The IRS has to be, there's got to be oversight. This is the first responsibility of the commissioner. The government is shut down effective October 2nd. There's been no movement that I know of. I don't think there's been any change here. So now we've got this complete shutdown. And what has happened is the IRS's staff has gone from 75,000 employees to under 40,000 employees. So less than half of the workforce is functioning in the IRS right now. They issued what they call a lapsed appropriations contingency plan. Has anybody curled up in front of the fireplace and read the lapsed appropriations contingency plan? No, they haven't. Here's what they did. They've got less than 40,000 employees that are on staff right now going into the IRS's office and functioning, and it's break down into a couple of different areas, but the key area is what are the essential functions of the IRS that they're keeping moving. That is the key here. And so what we've got here are a number of different categories. I'm not going to read every single one of them, but they got to complete and test the programming systems for the One Big Beautiful Bill implementation, which takes effect with next filing season, right? These computers have to be ready to go. They're going to continue to process payments, online payments, and payments that you send in a check to the IRS. Those envelopes get opened, those checks get processed. Mail processing continues, processing the disaster relief payments and transcripts. They're going to continue doing that. They want to protect statute expiration dates. That comes as no surprise. Collection statute expirations, they don't like those things running out over the last 5 years. I've seen more statute expirations, collection statute expiration dates come and go than at any other time in the last 45 years I've been paying attention. They're generally asleep at the switch when it comes to this stuff. They don't like to be, but they are. I think these expirations are going to continue. They're updating new tax forms and designing new tax forms. They're maintaining minimal building facilities, minimum staff necessary to perform accounting functions. They're protecting their own data, continuing with security with their own data. Thumbnail sketch of what is going on with the IRS right now inside the system, basically working at half staff. So the commissioner has got to deal with that, obviously, that challenge, but he's also got to deal with the challenge of losing 25,000 employees. As I said, they were at 100,000 on January 20th. January 21st, they're at roughly 75,000 now, but of course that's cut in half, so we got to deal with that. that. They got to retool these taxpayer assistant functions. All right. I am a firm believer in the fact that the IRS is to first and foremost help people comply with the law. We have a tax code that consists of more than 4 million words that was changed more than 6,000 times since 2001 alone. And that doesn't even count all of the things that have happened in the last 3 or 4 years, and certainly doesn't count the One Big Bill Act and all the changes that went along with that. So we've got a massive tax code. And the fact of the matter is, when it comes to lack of compliance, when it comes to failure to comply, the reality is that what we're dealing with more than anything is not people that don't want to fulfill their responsibilities, it's people that don't know how to fulfill their responsibilities. Shirley Peterson, way back in the early 1990s, made a statement to Congress then, which if it was true then, it's even more so now. She said, much of what we non-compliance with the tax code is really not non-compliance at all, it's lack of understanding. People will do what they're supposed to do if they know what they're supposed to do, and we have a tax code that's so complicated, so confusing, so massive that people can't figure it out for themselves. And even the professionals they turn to struggle to figure out what the responsibilities are. So this is what we're dealing with, and that has to be corrected. There's really only 2 ways to correct that. The first way is by simplifying the tax code, which to me is taking the Internal Revenue Code, bulldozing it, and starting over again. As a staunch promoter of abolishing the IRS and the income tax entirely, I maintain that position, and that's really the only simplification in my mind. The alternative to that is spending substantial resources on helping people comply. That means outreach, education, and taxpayer assistance. I'm talking about pre-filing assistance so people know what they're supposed to do on the front end so they're not ground into powder on the back end when they make some kind of a mistake. All right, so the commissioner's also got to focus on the processing systems and getting those systems ready for 2026. Now, the good news is this shutdown hasn't sent those folks home. They're still working there, but a serious concern here. The other thing that's going on right now is we've got the Taxpayer Assistance and Service Act, which has been sitting in Congress, really in the Senate, and the thing has been split up, and I've been writing about this over the course of the year and talking about the different aspects of the Taxpayer Assistance and Service Act. That is going to pass Congress one way or the other. That is going to be law sooner than later. There's just no question in my mind about that. The IRS Commissioner needs to oversee the implementation of the Taxpayer Assistance and Service Act, and the critical thing. I'm going to be talking about that in much more detail in 5. I'm going to break down 3 aspects of the Taxpayer Assistance and Service Act that we need to know about. So now we've got this acting commissioner, and that acting commissioner is the Treasury Secretary, so administration deal with that. Nominating a new commissioner on October 6th, the administration created a new position called the Chief Executive Officer of the Internal Revenue Service. They're not calling him a commissioner, they're calling him the Chief Executive Officer. I'm not sure what the difference is. The commissioner manages the day-to-day operations of the agency that he oversees. The Chief Executive Officer manages the day-to-day operations of the organization. It's the same job. And how a CEO of the IRS is not subject to consent of the Senate, but the commissioner of the IRS is. They've appointed a new chief executive officer to run the day-to-day operations. Percent is still the acting commissioner of the IRS, but now this chief executive officer is a guy, Frank Ano, an Italian guy from the Bronx. Happens to be the commissioner of the Social Security Administration. He's running the Social Security Administration, which is a huge job. That's the single largest outflow of revenue that the United States government has. Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid, the biggest draws on the federal fisc. You ask a lot of people, where's the federal government spending all its money? Spending all its money on defense. It's not even close. It's not even close. Defense is about 5th on the list. Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid, interest on the national debt, coming up on $1 trillion a year, and then we got defense in there somewhere. So Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid is the biggest draw on federal revenue, and the Social Security Administration is responsible for overseeing most of that. One thing I will say about Yano is he seems to be qualified to manage an organization like this. He's got a pretty substantial background in managing large financial organizations. The guy came out of the private sector, took the Social Security Administration earlier this year, I think April. He's got about 4 decades of experience in some of the world's largest financial institutions and technology companies. He served as chairman and CEO of Fiserv, which is the world's largest financial services payment technology company. And then 2019, he led the merger of Fiserv and First Data while he was serving as CEO of the Fiserv Corporation. He worked at JP Morgan Chase. He was the chief operating officer at the mortgage unit for JC Morgan. And the list goes on of what this guy's done. He seems like he's got the background to manage a large organization and thousands of employees and billions of dollars worth of budget, but the fact of the matter is he too is going to be spread too thin, in my opinion, standing here on the outside looking in. So that's the background of where we're at right now. So let's talk about IRS funding. Where are we at with IRS funding? You'll all recall that in 1992, Congress passed the Inflation Reduction Act. Under the Biden administration, the Inflation Reduction Act gave the IRS $80 billion in supplemental funding to be spread over 10 years. And when I say supplemental funding, that was on top of their ordinary operating budget, which approximated $12.5 billion a year. So $12.5 billion plus 8 pushed the IRS's annual budget over $20 billion a year, just about doubled it. All right. Of that $80 billion, they were going to hire 87,000 more IRS employees over the course of that 10-year period. I remember the conservative news media going crazy saying, oh, they're going to hire 87,000 workers. We're going to have an IRS guy on every street corner. That wasn't exactly what the plan was. They never were going to hire 87,000 IRS workers in 1 year, turn those people loose on America. The fact of the matter is, and I pointed this out in a number of articles I wrote over that period of time, the fact of the matter is during 2023, 2024, 2025, 2026, about a third of the IRS's workforce is eligible to retire. So basically that additional employment of 87,000 people over that period of time was going to keep the IRS constant in terms of its workforce. It wasn't going to double the size of the workforce. It just wasn't. And nobody looked at the numbers very carefully. Somebody had to do it, so I did it. And laid this out in some rational way. But the fact of the matter is, when the Trump administration took over and some conservatives got control of Congress, they started clawing that money back. But before we talk about the clawbacks, the thing that really raised my ire was how that money was appropriated, what they were going to do with the money in the first place, all right? So if you look at the bottom of page 2 of your outline, I'm talking there about how that money was allocated over that 10-year period of time, all right? So look at this, $3.18 billion for taxpayer services, all right? So the IRS is going to get $80 billion in new funding, and only $3 billion of it was going to go for taxpayer service. About $4.75 billion for computer systems, another $25 billion for operating support, general administrative, top of page 3, almost $46 billion for enforcement, including increased audits, collection, litigation support, and so on. So enforcement won over education by a ratio of 14-1, which to me was completely wrong-headed. And I have pointed out over and over again that 98% of every dollar collected by the federal government is collected through quote-unquote voluntary payments. And what I mean by a voluntary payment is not that somebody wakes up in the morning and says to themselves, I got some extra money, I think I'll send it to the federal government. That's not a voluntary payment. A voluntary payment is the act of the taxpayer paying their taxes without IRS enforcement. All right? That's a voluntary payment. And so when your clients send a check to the IRS and your businesses make those EFT deposits and, I got to send the IRS some money, their heart doesn't have to be in it. All right? It's not like giving money to a charitable organization, but that is a voluntary payment in the sense that it does not require IRS intervention to collect the money. All right? I like to call it the Vito Corleone definition of voluntary. Either your brains or your signature will be on the contract. Oh, okay. Well, I guess I'll sign right there. That's a voluntary payment. That's what they mean. But here's my point, friends. Not only 2% of federal revenue, and all you got to do is look at the IRS's data book to see where the revenue's coming from. It's just plain to see. Curl up in front of the fireplace and read the IRS's data book once in a while. 2% of revenue comes from enforcement, wage levies, bank levies, property seizures, and so on. It does not. Where is the IRS's budget better spent? We know that people will do what they're supposed to do if they understand what they're supposed to do. We know that they will fulfill their obligations if they know what those obligations are. If they're easy to understand, they will do what they're supposed to do. Nobody wants to get sideways with the IRS. People don't wake up in the morning and say, how can I piss off the IRS today? I know, I'll stop paying taxes. That doesn't happen. There's some tax fraud out there. We all know that. We've all run across that from time to time. But the overwhelming majority of people will do what they have to do to not get sideways with the IRS. I've had clients tell me 1,000 times, and you've all heard it too, I'll do anything to get these bastards off my back. What do I have to do? Just tell me what. Well, the simple answer is you got to pay it. I can't pay it. Okay. So that means it's not that easy to get them off your back. But the point is, people don't want to get sideways with the IRS. So the emphasis has to be taxpayer education, outreach, assistance, help people to comply with the law. They'll do what they're supposed to do if they know what they're supposed to do. This funding imbalance was so fundamentally flawed in my opinion. I spoke out against it. I wrote a number of articles that are published on National Review that talked about this. And it seems that Congress is getting it now because Congress has reduced IRA funding now. Went from $80 billion, it's down to $37.6 billion as of March 2025. There hasn't been any changes since. So they clawed back about half that money. They clawed back about half that money and they redesignated how it needs to be spent. The Fiscal Responsibility Act clawed back a bunch. The Further Consolidation Appropriations Act clawed back $20 billion. Another $20 billion from the Continuing Appropriations Extension in early 2025. All of the cuts, $41 billion worth of clawbacks, were focused at enforcement. So Congress said you aren't using any money to increase IRS enforcement. Here's the current spending breakdown, middle of page 3 of your outline, point number 3. Current IRA supplemental funding, about $38 billion, is focused on operations support, business systems modernization, that's tutors, right? Buying tutors and technology. Taxpayer services, it's still low, closer in balance. And then energy security. And when we're talking about energy security, we're talking about implementing the clean energy credits, right? And there's a number of clean energy credits for manufacturing, recycling, materials refining, and so on. And that's what we're talking about there. So $500 million to implement these clean energy credits. And then the direct file system. Now, there's been some changes with the direct file system that we'll talk about in just a second here as well. In 2023, when the IRS got its $80 billion worth of funding, it created a document called the Inflation Reduction Act Strategic Operating Plan. I talked about that in this defense conference in the fall of 2023. We went through that operating plan and it spelled out how the IRS was going to spend its $46 billion in enforcement. It outlined what they call their transformation objectives. Here's how we're going to transform the agency based on this money and these resources that we've got. They created this office called the Office of Transformation and Strategy. This office was going to oversee that, and but that's gone. That's gone. They completely eliminated the Office of Transformation Strategy, was shut down in March of 2025, and now they have to reevaluate everything with the money they do have through the proposed 2026 operating budget. This budget was proposed back in April of this year, and it stalled. There were only 3 appropriations bills that passed. One was for the Agricultural Department, one was for the military, and the other one was for class. Anyone who made sure they got paid? Class, anyone? The legislature. Right? So Congress made sure that they got paid in all of this insanity, but the IRS's appropriations bill did not pass. The 2026 operating budget will put the IRS's budget at $9.8 billion plus the supplemental funding still available through the Inflation Reduction Act. That money's still on the table, half of what it was, but it's still on the table. This is the first time that I have seen an actual real money reduction in the IRS's operating budget since I've been paying attention. I'm willing to be wrong about that. I'm willing for somebody to say, man, in 1993, and that's humanly possible, that I missed one, but it's not likely. So this is the first time their numbers have actually gone down. Now you hear Congress and the IRS screaming all the time, certain members of Congress screaming all the time, and certainly the IRS screaming all the time that we've had budget cuts, we've had budget cuts. No, what you've had are baseline cuts. And baseline cuts are different than real money budget cuts. The baseline cut says if our budget is $100 million this year and inflation is 3%, then we have to go to $103 million. That's a baseline budget increase. And they would say that budget increase is keeping pace with inflation, so it's not a budget increase at all. Now, if the budget increase is supposed to be $3 billion and it's only $2 billion, it goes from $100 billion to $102, they call that a budget cut. We've had a budget cut. No, you haven't had a budget cut. You got more money this year than you got last year. That's an increase, but it hasn't kept pace with inflation. But it's not a cut in funding. Let's be clear about that. And so those are the types of cuts they have pointed to over the years. But this one, going from 12.3 down to 9.8, that is a legitimate cut. And I say, how about take it from 9.8 down to 2? Let's take it down to 2. And then we can get serious about cutting their budget from there. Because as I said, my goal is not a fully funded IRS. I don't even know what that means. Fully fund the IRS. To do what? I say fully unfund the IRS, fully defund the IRS, eliminate the agency, lock, stock, and barrel, bulldoze the income tax and the Internal Revenue Code, and start over with something that makes sense. But that's a different discussion for a different time. All right, so how is this budget going to be split up? Again, this is in the proposal that hasn't passed Congress yet. It's on the table as soon as the shutdown stops. At some point it's going to stop. I don't know when, but it will stop. The Babylon Bee ran a great article a couple of weeks ago that said the Democrats are dug in on this shutdown. They're dug in. and they're determined to make sure that the shutdown continues until somebody notices. I guess that's the question. Do people in the real world even know that the federal government shut down? Of course, we experience it because of the jobs that we're in. We're unique, and so that's different. Okay, so taxpayer services. Now, of the $9 billion, they've got north of $3.5 billion dedicated for taxpayer services. That's a third of the budget. All right, now we're getting somewhere. Now we're doing the things that we need to do to help people comply. These are for pre-filing assistance programs, tax counseling for the elderly, taxpayer advocate service, fully fund the taxpayer advocate service. These are the people whose job is to function as a liaison between the IRS and the taxpayer to help people resolve problems with the agency. These are the people that we need to have on the job and to have access to IRS systems to fix this. They've also got about $7 million designated for identity theft. Identity theft is a huge problem. The IRS right now has about a 400,000 case backlog working identity theft problems. So if you got a client with an identity theft problem, don't hold your breath. They're saying it takes 20 months to work through an ID theft case. In the meantime, your client's got to have an ID theft PTIN that they assign, and you can't use their social security number anymore. And a lot of you understand the mess that creates. We're not going to get too deep into that, but the fact of the matter is they need to do something about that backlog. And then number two, $3.6 billion in enforcement. Okay, fine. You got some enforcement for audits and collection, criminal investigation, and so on. They're funding the Interagency Crime and Drug Enforcement Program, which the IRS has spent a great deal of time over the last 20 years using its Criminal Investigation Division to prosecute drug dealers, drug lords, that sort of thing, more so than tax crimes, really. They spend a great deal more time in the drug-related interagency prosecutions than they do in pure tax prosecutions. And then investigative technology, $35 million in investigative technology. And what that looks like is there's a company out there called Palantir. Does the name PayPal ring a bell with anybody? Palantir is the parent company that created PayPal, and they've got these computer gurus working for this company. They have a $100 million contract effective September 2025 with this Criminal Investigation Division, specifically to mine data. Now, this isn't the first such contract. I wrote about this 5 years ago when Palantir got their first contract with the IRS, which was about a $70 or $80 billion test contract to see if they could produce what they needed to produce. The data they're mining, Palantir is data mining for the Criminal Investigation Division, combing the internet. Think artificial intelligence, combing the internet, all of the social media sites, your Facebook, TikTok, whatever all these things are that people put all these videos up there. And so they're data mining this stuff on an ongoing basis, looking for criminal investigation leads. So we got this guy over here that's posting every single week. He posts a new story about his trip to some other country in the world. We went to Greece, we went to Italy, we went to Spain. There, isn't this magnificent? Look at all these artifacts, right? And the IRS says, gee, this guy must be really rich, taking all these trips around the world. Wait a minute, his tax return says he only made $35,000 a year for the last 4 years. How can he afford all these trips on $35,000 a year? He must have unreported income. And so this is the idea between the data mining, feeding the Criminal Investigation Division, and they're spending $100 million to be able to mine that data, get into every public database and categorize the data that will allow them to function. Technology and operations support, general agency support, facility services, and so on. And now look at point 3B there, which fascinates me. The IRS must submit a report to the Appropriations Committees of Congress and the Comptroller General detailing major information technology investments. This, to me, is the proof of the frustration that has finally hit Congress with respect to the IRS's use of information technology. The IRS has spent billions of dollars over the last 35 years, starting in the mid-1990s, on technology upgrades, all right? They call it business systems modernization. We need new computers. We need new technology. We need to be able to do this. Our systems are outdated. How many of you heard the IRS say that the IRS is operating on 1960s technology? Who's heard? All hands go up. We've all heard that. It's complete nonsense, and they've spent over $3 billion, $3.5 to $4 billion on technology upgrades, and you're telling me they're still operating on 1960s? I've heard the phrase Beatles era technology. In the 1960s, most of you were young people, but some of you might remember what was going on. How much paperless technology was there in the 1960s? How much machine reading equipment did we have in the 1960s? Of course, this stuff did not exist for the most part. They've got to make a report now to the Comptroller General and the funding agencies of Congress on anything they want to do technology-wise. They got to explain the nature of the program, the cost, the completion schedule, the details, how it's going to operate, future budget requests, requests and so on. Middle of page 5, my point 4, business systems modernization, gets a total appropriation of $0 under this plan. So somebody in Congress has got fed up with the IRS just whizzing money away on computer technology, which I say, what took them so long? Why did it take them 30, 25 years at least to get going with this? Part 3, bottom of page 5. Other proposed administrative provisions, right? There's a number of other administrative provisions in this appropriations bill that is going to pass. The question is, when is it going to pass? But it will pass because the IRS needs appropriation just like everybody else. There's a provision in the bill that would prevent the IRS from transferring funds interagency-wise. They can't take it from taxpayer assistance and put it over to enforcement. All government agencies have done that. Move money around. It's been appropriated over here. We've got it in our hands. So instead of spending it here, we're spending it there. It's still within our appropriation. But the IRS will be specifically precluded from interagency transfers of funds without specific consent of Congress. Employee training requirements. I find this interesting. The bill would require employees be trained in taxpayers' rights, dealing courteously with taxpayers, cross-cultural relations, ethics, impartial application of the tax code. And I would ask you, well, aren't they doing that? First of all, we've got a law in the books. I'm sure all of you are familiar with Internal Revenue Codes, section 6304. If you're not familiar with 6304, you need to be familiar with Code section 6304. This is titled the Fair Tax Collection Practices, and this is modeled after the Federal Fair Debt Collections Practices Act. This is the IRS's answer to it. Section 6304 prohibits the IRS from communicating with taxpayers if they know they're represented. It prohibits the IRS from communicating with taxpayers in a manner that they know is improper or unreasonable, for example, at work or at school. It also precludes the prohibition of harassment and abuse, the use of violence or the threat of violence or other criminal means to harm somebody, the use of obscene or profane language, causing a telephone to ring over and over again. So if you haven't read the law, you need to read the law. This law has been on the books since 1998. This was part of the IRS Restructuring and Reform Act. We're coming up on 30 years of this being a law on the books, and now we're just having some direction for the IRS employees to be trained in this. They want to prioritize taxpayer confidentiality to prevent ID theft. Good luck with that. All right, we've got a river of information that's flowing into the Internal Revenue Service every single year. We got 260 or 70 million business and individual income tax returns, another 3.5 to 4 billion information returns, W-2s, 1099s. It's a river of data, and every single day that goes by, there's criminals out there trying to find a way to hack that data. And they have hacked the data. The IRS has been hacked a couple of times over the last 20 years. We've all heard the stories about that. The director of the Treasury Inspector General for Tax Administration back in the teens of this century, I don't know when it was, 2012, 2013, something like that, called identity theft the crime of this. And it hasn't gotten better. It's only getting worse. We talked about the backlog here a minute ago. It's something that just goes on. Phone service enhancement, number 4 on the list, bottom of page 5. Phone service enhancement. The IRS gets 100 million phone calls a year, friends. During the COVID period of 2021 and 2022, there was 281 million calls in 2021 and 103 million calls to the IRS in 2022. If you want a reason to abolish the Internal Revenue Service and the Internal Revenue Code the way it's written right now, that's reason enough. 100 million phone calls a year to the agency. What do I do? How do I do? The level of service, the ratio at which those calls were answered during the COVID period was horrific. It was less than 10% in some of those periods that the IRS looked at. This has got to be fixed. There's no question about the fact that it's got to be fixed. Number 5 on the list is special consideration of offers and compromise. If a taxpayer was a fraud victim, then they're going to get special consideration in offers. First Amendment protection coming out of the case of the National Religious Broadcasters versus the U.S., where the challenge was made to the Johnson Amendment. The Johnson Amendment is the provision of Section 501c3 of the code that prevents charitable organizations from getting involved in candidates for public office, supporting or opposing a specific candidate for public office or a specific legislative proposal. And so these exempt organizations risked losing their 501c3 status if they got involved with that. Now they're telling us that no funds can be made available under the Act can be used by the IRS to target citizens of the United States for exercising any right guaranteed by the First Amendment, and that scrutiny based on ideology is similarly precluded. They can't use any funds to target groups for regulatory scrutiny based on their ideological beliefs. They want to crack down on tax compliance of IRS employees. Supposedly there's 50 million in back taxes owed by current IRS employees that go back as far as 5 years, which I find interesting because in the IRS Restructuring and Reform Act of 1998, they included a provision that allowed for the firing of IRS employees, the 10 deadly sins. One of the 10 reasons an IRS person could get fired from their job. Violating taxpayers' rights was one of them, and one of them was not paying their taxes. I think you can count on one hand the number of IRS employees that have been fired in the last 25 years for not paying their taxes, and it's gotten to the point where it's got some attention from some folks here. So they're going to give direct hire authority to the IRS for tax return processing so they don't have to go through all of the technicalities of hiring workers. We're going to talk more about that. The free e-filing program has been scrubbed. They had this e-filing program that was conflicting with or competing with all of the other free file programs that were offered by software developers. H&R Block has one, TurboTax has one. Congress said, no, we're not going to keep with that. And there's pros and cons to that. On the one hand, the IRS wrote the law. They should help people comply with the law. You shouldn't have to hire a tax professional just to meet the minimum requirements of compliance with the tax law. You should to look at the law and ascertain for yourself if you got some reasonable level of intelligence. Ascertain for yourself what you're supposed to do and not supposed to do, and then take the steps to comply without having to hire some high-priced professional to come in and help you comply. To me, that's a fundamental element of due process. Understanding what the law requires of you and fulfilling those obligations without additional expense. There's an argument to be made for such a program. My response to that is abolish the damn law to begin with. All right, that's my response, but that's just me. Point 11, bottom of page 6, no increase in firearms or ammunition, which I thought was funny. During the Obama years, you might recall the flap created when the Obama administration funded the purchase of 1.5 billion rounds of 9mm handgun ammunition. Everybody panicked. Oh, they're going to be on the streets. They're going to be shooting us in the doors. None of that happened. But anyway, no more purchases of firearms. That's the end of that. Point 12, no digital currency. You might recall during the Biden administration that the administration put forth a very detailed, very specific plan to create an official United States digital currency to compete with the stuff that was out there. And the idea was, there's so much fraud out there in this digital currency world, and all of these people are out there losing their retirement funds to these digital currency fraudulent schemes, and so we better have our own currency. And so they had this detailed plan to do this, and alongside that plan was a discussion, never fully put forth into a plan, to abolish United States currency. $5 bills, $10 bills, $100 bills. They wanted to abolish all this U.S. currency in favor of their digital currency. And so what this plan proposes is that there will be no money spent on the creation of a digital currency and no money spent on a study or a decision or a plan to discontinue the use of paper currency as legal tender in the United States. All right, so top of page 7, we're going to bring the ship in for a landing here and then we'll take a few questions. No enforcement. There will be no enforcement of the beneficial ownership reporting. The Corporate Transparency Act that drove us all crazy there for a while, where we had to file these reports with the Treasury Department on any organization that was created through a Secretary of State. So that would have been a corporation, it would have been not a partnership, limited liability companies, limited liability partnerships, anything set up through a Secretary of State acknowledgement. There had to be a statement of beneficial interest filed with the Treasury Department telling the government who owned shares and who were the decision makers and so on. So that is no longer they cannot enforce that anymore. There have been some court decisions that ruled on the constitutionality of that to begin with, so they stopped enforcing it. Now there's going to be no further enforcement, and the Treasury has to report on the status and use of all the information they did acquire during that period of time. And the bottom line here now, the last thing on my list, point 14 on page 7, is going to be a study on the acquisition of digital currency. This is different from the creation of an official U.S. digital currency. They will be precluded from creating a U.S. digital currency. But the question is going to be, should the United States acquire a strategic reserve of digital currency that's already out there on the market and being traded? This study will address whether they should acquire digital currency as part of the U.S. strategic reserves. Our strategic reserves involve natural gas, oil, gold. Should we have a strategic reserve of digital currency? I'm not going to pretend to answer that question here. I don't have an answer to that question here, whether we should or shouldn't. I don't